Got it.
Ok, estamos no ar.
Obrigado, pessoal. Bom dia. A gente pede desculpa pelo atraso, um pequeno desencontro aqui na questão da transmissão via YouTube. Bom dia para quem está aqui presente, bom dia para quem está assistindo a gente pelo YouTube, a gente vai acompanhar também. Nós, então, estamos recebendo, é um prazer aqui receber o professor Benedict Fischer. O Benedict é professor do Center for Applied Research in Mental Health and Addiction, da Faculdade de Ciências da Saúde da Simon Fraser University, no Canadá. Ele vai fazer uma conferência a respeito da legalização da maconha no Canadá, para uso, né, não médico. Eu estava dizendo a ele, um pouquinho antes da gente começar, que é uma conferência, o momento da conferência não poderia ser melhor, porque a previsão é que o Supremo retome, em princípio amanhã, aquele julgamento de 7 anos, né, a respeito da descriminalização do usuário. Então, acho que a gente vai aproveitar bastante. Amanhã a gente vai ter um workshop mais fechado, em torno aí de projetos possibilidade de projetos de pesquisa, onde ele vai detalhar um pouco mais os trabalhos dele, a gente pensar em parcerias futuras, está todo mundo convidado também. Benedict, it's a pleasure to have you here at the Institute. I think your speech will contribute a lot to the debate on cannabis in Brazil. As I told you, the Supreme Court will resume the trial, the judgment about the decriminalization of marijuana users in Brazil. So it's very important to talk about it, and well, let's do it.
So we still need to put this here.
It's not yet, so não, eu acho que é só clicar aqui. A gente só esqueceu disso.
No, it's okay. It's coming. Oh, I think it's coming on.
I think so. Yeah. Vou acertar qual é. Vai, né, a gente que vai sair daqui 8 anos de direção, aqui você põe a luz que apaga aqui da frente. Ó, você acende, então essa já apagou. Essa, não, mas essa apaga tudo, né? Tá bom? Ok.
Luta de tecnologia is one. Everything.
Good. I don't know how many people. That's
It would be good to know if it's 1 or 1,000.
Yeah, no. More than one, less than 1,000.
Probably. Ok. Bom dia a todos. Muito obrigado para Rossano. This is where I will stop my Portuguese and I switch to English. Otherwise, we will be here for a long time and you will be very tired at the end. We want to avoid that effect. But it's a great pleasure to be here at IMS. Many thanks to Rossano, who's worked tirelessly to make this happen in a relatively short time. I think we were very efficient in battling what is known as the famous Brazilian bureaucracy, but we made it all happen. It's a great pleasure to be here for me, also as someone who has worked in different roles and places in Brazil academically for about 25 years. I know your country, your culture, your society very well, and obviously this work has not been coerced but voluntary, so I've been coming back a lot because I treasure and really appreciate your country and the people and your culture. So I'm here to talk to you about a topic that is even more timely than I thought, with comments by Hossano that your Supreme Court will look into the legal status of cannabis use in this country, which is interesting, and I'm sure there will be important links. I also hope you noticed Hossano's and my twin appearance in color. There's a funny episode. I tried to be respectful, of course. Yesterday, I went to the hotel and asked for a tejo so I can iron my shirt. And so to exemplify a little bit the cultural contingency of public health and safety, they told me I cannot have a fejo because it's not seguro. It's not secure for me to do this on my own, but I can walk through the door of the hotel and immediately get hit by a car and maybe get shot. That's no problem. So different assumptions about public health and safety depending on culture as well. But back to the topic. Cannabis legalization in Canada. What I want to do is give you an overview from a public health perspective on this legalization initiative. So this is not a Bob Marley talk. To promote cannabis use is to look at cannabis and different policy options, specifically legalization from a public health, a scientific, evidence-based policy perspective, different angles. I'm going to do three main things, and we'll see a little bit how it goes. I have a lot of material. We'll be here for a long time, but I'll try and give you a sort of a panoramic overview. Talk to you a little bit about the context of cannabis in Canada, because it's a little bit different than what you have in Brazil, a bit about social epidemiology and history. I will talk about how legalization came about and its basic parameters, because there are some false assumptions about what it is, and it's a little bit more complicated. Describe this a bit, and then I will tell you a bit what we know about legalization 5 years after implementation in terms of outcomes and developments, to assess a little bit how has this worked, what are the challenges, and where are things now. And a lot of this, I'm sure you'll be able to also apply for potential discussions in Brazil. So this will be the overview. I suggest that I do and give you sort of my talk going forward, and then at the end we will make sure we reserve some room and time for questions and discussion and whatever you would like to have clarified. I hope my English will be clear and concise. You can follow. I think it's a lot better than the interrupted translation. All right. Okay. Just for standard disclosures, I have never had commercial or private monies. I've been lucky to have a lot of public and governmental research funding, but no private or industry money whatsoever, which is increasingly becoming relevant in the field of cannabis, becoming a commercial good as well. So that as a categorical disclosure. So to talk a little bit about the context of cannabis in Canada, you'll see the map here in terms of basic prevalence. Canada, together with the US and Australia, is one of the high-use countries of cannabis. The consumption is a lot higher than, for example, in Brazil. You see here that by 2018-19, there's a prevalence of, in the general population, of about between 20 and 30%, depending on how you measure. So up to 1 in 3 Canadians in the general population are involved with cannabis use. You in Brazil have a prevalence of somewhere around 7 to 10%, depending where you look. So it's a lot higher than what you have here. It's a popular drug, and in some subgroups, it's more common now than, for example, tobacco consumption. Of course, the key concern is, you see right here, that up to 45% or 50% of young people ages 15 to 24 have involvement with cannabis use. That's a lot for what was an illegal drug until a couple of years ago. a little bit about history, 100 years of history in 1 minute. Cannabis, pretty much exactly 100 years ago, was made an illegal drug in historical development that basically saw most of the illegal drugs today, specifically opioids, cocaine, and eventually cannabis, becoming criminalized. Mostly not because of concern about public health, but because of racism, more or less. Those were social political developments. All of those drugs were associated with some racial minority. Initially, the opioids, opium with Asian people, the Chinese, cocaine, mostly with Black people, and cannabis, at the time, marijuana, of course, influenced through American prohibition. Don't forget, Canada is the neighbor of the US in North America, and a population is small. So 100 years ago, there was not a lot of independence, but marijuana basically associated with Mexicans primarily. So these were basically racism-driven politics to marginalize cultural specific behaviors. These drugs became criminalized. In the 1950s, 60s, we have the emergence of the international drug control system, dominated primarily by the US for several decades, which then enshrined the criminalization of all of these drugs into international conventions that basically said you must not allow these drugs, the use of these drugs, the availability, you must criminalize the users and the people who produce them. So this is basically the international system that created the categorical divide between what are illegal drugs and the legal drugs of alcohol and tobacco today. So based on this criminalization in the 1960s and 70s, the police started to enforce drug laws quite a bit and focused more and more on cannabis. And so what we talk about is the counterculture in the 70s, a lot of people going to university, going to other places, fairly established middle-class people engaged in cannabis use. There were a lot of arrests all of a sudden in the 1970s. And this is when resistance to criminalization began, because all of a sudden, a lot of people that were supposedly decent citizens, established lives, were arrested, would potentially go to jail or get a criminal conviction and have a criminal record. I know a lot of lawyers, for example, they were older people, retired now, but they went to university in the 1970s, had a great career ahead of themselves as a judge or a prosecutor, and then were caught with a joint somewhere on the street, arrested and got a criminal record, and all of a sudden they weren't becoming a judge or a prosecutor anymore because they were a criminalized person with a criminal record. They were labeled criminal. And that happened with thousands and thousands of people. And this is when, for the first time, resistance developed to the criminalization of cannabis in the 70s. There were a number of commissions in Canada, the Ledain Commission, in England, even in the US, there were, under President Carter, there were commissions that were looking into the criminalization, its benefits, its adverse effects, and all of them recommended to reform this approach. They said cannabis is really not that dangerous a drug, and the criminalization produces excessive adverse consequences, especially for users. We should change this. What happened? Nothing. Many reports, many recommendations for change for 50 years now. In the US, one of the additional problems was that the leader of that national reform, who wrote this reform report under President Carter, was caught with cocaine in his pocket at some point. So of course they had to make all this go away. But basically, a lot of talk about policy reform in the last 50 years, but really no action. In Canada, pretty much every political party advocated cannabis law reform, but only when they were in opposition. And when they were in government, all of a sudden, they didn't want to talk about this anymore. So we had several recommendations over the past decades, but really no policy change. Cannabis remained a criminal offense until a few years ago. And one of the major other sources of resistance, of course, has been the police. They always advocated against reform. Why? The main practical reason is that, so we have a pretty well-regulated law enforcement and police system in Canada. It's very difficult. You need concrete reasons to arrest or search someone, like to search, go in their car, go in their house. You need reasonable evidence. However, drug laws and specifically cannabis laws made it very easy to arrest someone temporarily and search them, because all the officer would need to say is, I think I smelled something. I think I smelled some marijuana. You are under arrest. I can go in your house. I can go in your car. I can go in your pocket. That's why the police really liked that offense as a criminal offense and didn't want to lose it. So these are all the different pieces that basically maintain the criminalization status of what is a relatively innocuous. I'm not going to use the term harmless. Cannabis isn't a harmless drug, but a relatively limited drug in terms of actual health harms until just recently. This is a little bit about the developments of cannabis enforcement and arrests. If you go into those numbers and details, you will see that the majority of drug arrests for any drug in Canada, about 50 to 60% for most of the past years, were for cannabis possession, meaning small amount of marijuana that someone would have in their pockets or something that is just enough for a joint. You could get criminally arrested, you could go to court, you would get a fine, but you would be labeled a criminal. If you have that criminal record, you will have problems getting housing, you will have problems with quite a number of different kinds of jobs and work, and you will immediately be banned from travel to many other countries, including the US, that asked on the immigration form, have you ever been criminally convicted? Yes. Cannabis possession, sorry, cannot come in. Okay, just a little bit, don't be too overwhelmed. I'm going to summarize, or you can look in depth into some of the things that they interest you. What are the concerns around cannabis and health harms? In summary, as I said, it's not a harmless drug, okay? There are risks for adverse health consequences. However, they are quite clearly understood for most things, and they are limited in the number of key domains. So we have acute psychomotor, cognitive, mental impairment. It can go up to psychotic states for some users, depending on the kind of cannabis that's being used. There, in terms of long-term effects, there are moderate associations with adverse mental health outcomes. So we're talking odds ratios of between 1.5 and 3 for psychosis, for depression, for suicide, but we have to be careful about causality. There can be third factor variables involved. There can actually be reverse directionality. We know that people with some mental health problems use cannabis for self-medication. So careful about that. There's the risk of cannabis use disorder. You can become dependent. That is possible. Psychological and physical dependence involves about a quarter, more or less, of users given the population. There are risks for motor due to related psychomotor and cognitive impairment. There's risk for motor vehicle crash involvement. If you use cannabis, your risk of getting involved in a non-fatal or fatal accident approximately doubles. So it's not a huge effect, but it is a discernible effect. The risks increase. And then there's some evidence for pulmonary problems, primarily for people who smoke, especially with tobacco. There's some evidence about adverse cardiovascular events with high potency cannabis. There's some evidence on compromised fetal development or neonatal outcomes for mothers who use cannabis a lot primarily in the first trimester of pregnancy. The important thing is, again, so if I was a psychiatrist, which I'm not, I would emphasize all these things and basically conclude it's a very dangerous drug, but I'm a public health scientist. And so I tell you, most cannabis use is relatively free of serious adverse outcomes in most consumption episodes. However, there are potentially severe harms that are approximately concentrated in somewhere between 25 and 30% of consumers. These are typically characterized by three factors. They begin use early in life, early initiation of use. They use frequently, meaning almost daily or daily. And they use high potency cannabis, i.e. with a THC content of 10% or higher for flower product, or what is increasingly common are extracts for dabbing with very high THC content. These three factors are the main determinants that epidemiology tells us are the principal predictors of serious adverse outcomes of cannabis use. And that's, of course, important for public health and targeted prevention. So we and other people have engaged in some assessments of burden of disease, formal measurement of burden of disease. And I assume that here in IMS somewhere that concept is taught. The formal measurement with DALIs and years of life lost, like the formal metrics of burden of disease. And of course, when you listen to the public discourse around cannabis and health harms, what you hear most of the time, or what is your guess? What you hear most of the time, anyone a guess? What do people talk about most with cannabis and health harms? Psychosis, mental health problems. That's typically what you hear in the public debate a lot, and what is most prominent. And of course, it has to do a little bit also with the quality of that effect. We're all scared of mental health problems and psychosis in particular, right? It's still a very scary kind of problem. You don't want people, well, to go crazy from using a drug. But if you actually look at the formal measurements of burden of disease, psychiatric outcomes, or specifically psychosis, that are cannabis attributable, meaning truly caused by cannabis. That is a very, very small percentage. As a matter of fact, the estimates are that even only the minority of cannabis-related psychosis incidents, in other words, people who go to a hospital because they have a psychotic experience related to cannabis, only the minority of those are actually caused by cannabis. There's typically other factors, genetic or reverse causality, that play a role. But overall, in a simple nutshell, the main factors of burden of disease from cannabis are cannabis use disorder for people who become dependent, because that's a relatively large proportion, and it's mostly young people. And so if you take all this together, the main burden of disease is from cannabis use disorder. We made a formal assessment estimate of about 70% of cannabis-related burden of disease, and motor vehicle accidents, also a relatively extensive burden of disease. Why? One of the main reasons, because it's one of the few outcomes where you can actually have death that is related to cannabis, because there can be accidents where people die. There are really no other ways of how cannabis can naturally kill you. You can't die of a cannabis overdose. Basically impossible. I mean, there's some anecdotal cardiovascular events, but it's not like opioids or cocaine or even alcohol where you can die. So for burden of disease, the burden of disease related to cannabis compared to tobacco or alcohol is relatively small because it doesn't cause a lot of deaths. But motor vehicle accidents are an exception. So there are a few deaths related to cannabis impairment. So this is basically what the burden of disease picture looked like you must be interested in cannabis use disorder. There are quite a few cases, motor vehicle accidents, and psychiatric outcomes, including psychosis, are sort of at the lower rank of adverse burden of disease. So let's fast forward to the 17th of October, 2018. I remember it well because it was my last day in Canada. I had specifically arranged this. I began the next day a job in New Zealand. This is the day when legalization of cannabis in Canada was implemented. And I say specifically legalization, and if you're a bit familiar with this debate or this space, you will know how to differentiate the terms legalization and decriminalization. Decriminalization is a sort of a gray area where usually the punitiveness or the scope of punishment gets reduced, but it is still something that's not legal and where there is typically some punishment or some legal control. We had legalization in Canada implemented, legalization and regulated non-medical cannabis use and supply, which means that this substance, both for use and its availability, became legal, similar to alcohol and tobacco. And I will tell you a little bit about how that happened and the parameters. And of course, the crucial figure in all of this was this man. I don't know if you recognize him, Justin Trudeau, elected Prime Minister in 2015. Of course, the son of the famous Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was Prime Minister from the 60s to the 80s in Canada, is a very famous guy. Started his professional career as a teacher, and then became a member of parliament and was elected in a landslide in 2015 to be Prime Minister. And he always sort of, a lot of people like Trudeau. I'm a bit more critical of him, but he always sort of tried to emulgate to be a little bit of a Canadian Barack Obama. So very smart, cool, in touch with society and in touch with young people. And of course, he very quickly understood at the time before he was elected in 2015 that cannabis and legalization was a very hip topic that could gain him votes at the time. And he made it very clear when he was running his election campaign in 2015 that he wanted to legalize cannabis. So he made that promise before his election. He put it on his platform and said, I'm going to do this, among other things, if I get elected. And he did get elected. And here I'm just showing you a few pictures of things. So, for example, I remember when legalization was eventually implemented in 2018, and I saw this kind of sign at an airport in Canada for the first time, where cannabis is mentioned officially as a legal drug, and it talks about the legality. It's a major change after 100 years of that drug being illegal, and all of a sudden it being dealt with as a legal drug was a major change. But let's talk a little bit about how we got there. I first want to talk a little bit about why, from a policy perspective, we would even think about legalization as a policy option. And this may be relevant for the Brazilian debate or discourse as well, because there are different approaches or different reasons that people give why legalization is the better approach. So first of all, when you have a drug that's illegal or criminal, you can't really do anything. You can't control quality, you can't control access. It's basically just illegal, and you rely on its illegal status, mainly deterrence, and people stay away from it and no one will touch it. You can't control anything, you can't regulate. So in the book that we wrote, Cannabis Policy Beyond Stalemate, probably the most important sentence is, only what is legal you can regulate. So you can only regulate a product or access or make active prevention when something is legal. So this is one rationale for saying, well, we're making cannabis legal, not because we want to promote it, but we want to have the opportunity to work with it, to intervene, to regulate, to improve quality, those kinds of things. Of course, there's the argument about the disproportionality of risks and control vis-a-vis alcohol and tobacco. We have alcohol and tobacco, they cause a lot of problems. They kill a lot of people, the burden of disease high, but they are legal. Cannabis burden of disease is about 20%, but it's illegal. Makes no sense, right? You want your policy to be proportional and sensible. So the relationship between legal and illegal drugs from that side of sense, from that angle, does not make a lot of sense. And there's an argument to be made to make this more, we talk about policy coherence, that there's a more of a proportional approach. We've talked about the excessive adverse effects of criminal enforcement. So, as I gave the example earlier, you have a little bit of marijuana in your pocket for a half a joint, maybe you get arrested, you get a criminal record, you get a fine, you get problems with your work, with travel, with housing. These adverse effects can destroy your life. For a little bit of maconha in your pocket does not make a lot of sense, right? Since it's very excessive consequence. So this is something that a lot of people say is a good reason to legalize. Now, we talked about decriminalization. Brazil, you mentioned it. I won't go into the details, but I've done a lot of work on outcomes of decriminalization, and I typically describe it as from a rock to a hard place. It's an English expression, which basically means you improve some things, but you create new problems. Decriminalization is a very tricky thing because it typically gives the criminal justice system discretion. The police can decide, I like your face, we let you go, but you know it's too black, you go to prison, or we make some punishment, so discretion is a problem. It is still illegal. You still can't really work with it because it's not a legal substance. You can't make open prevention. It is somewhere between everything and nothing, and creates a lot of ambiguity. I personally don't believe that decriminalization is a very workable policy framework for really improving things, but I'll leave that as sort of a side debate. Then, of course, there's a lot of people who come and say, we should legalize cannabis because it's a medical drug. It cures everything, it's good for you, it's therapeutic. Okay, caution. There's some evidence for some things, certain forms of pain, for example, a few other disease categories where there is some evidence for some therapeutic effect for some people. But I don't think we're anywhere close to saying cannabis is a therapeutic substance categorically. That's not what the evidence supports. And of course, you also have to be careful. There's an increasing commercial industry for cannabis. And of course, they love this discourse or narrative, right? Because it is a lot easier to sell and promote a substance that's supposedly therapeutic rather than recreational or even dangerous. So caution. The public discourse on this has spun very out of control. And I urge you to really look for the evidence and what is supported by evidence. And then there's the argument of cannabis as a source for government tax revenue if it's legal, right? There are a lot of people who say, well, you make it legal and then the government makes a lot of money and we give for prevention and we build schools and we save the planet. Caution. There's a lot of fake assumptions about tax revenue from cannabis, or depending on what you calculate, what you consider. From all I see and the numbers I see and the signs I have seen, there's no reason to assume that this will really make money, because you may save money on criminal enforcement, but you will have some new problems. You need to build a regulatory system you will probably spend as much as you gain. So caution with this particular argument as well. And then, of course, there's a political dimension, especially younger people, as I mentioned with Trudeau's example earlier. Politicians know how to use legalization that is particularly popular with young people in potential elections as a political argument. And that plays into the political, because at the end of the day, legalization is a political decision, right? It's made by politicians. So they understand that this is a popular concept by young people who, of course, also understand these disproportionalities a lot. So these are the different, I would say, factors that play a role into the reasons or rationales for legalization. But you need to ask yourself which ones of those are really valid and which ones are appropriate to support the decision. And I'll be happy, especially given the pending developments in Brazil, talk to you a bit more about decriminalization experiences and potential fallbacks, because that debate will obviously be activated in Brazil. In Canada, when legalization was implemented, there were three named objectives by the government. One was to improve public health and safety. So that's a pretty clear expectation and objective. The second one was improve youth protection and prevention. And there was the literal, this is a literal quote. I'm very good with my academic formalities. This is in quotations. This is what the government said. We will legalize and therefore keep cannabis out of the hands of youth. So it basically promised we will have better prevention or reduce cannabis use among young people. And I urge you to keep that sentence in mind for some of the data we're going to look at later. This is, of course, I can already indicate this. This is a daring political promise, right? It's, of course, very attractive to parents, to society at large. Oh, we will legalize, and my child will be less likely to be confronted or exposed to cannabis, or less likely to use a drug I'm concerned with. But it's a good question why legalization will do that. And we'll see that in a moment. And it promised, or it suggested, to reduce illicit cannabis markets and related criminal activity, which of course is a sensical assumption. You make a drug that was so far only illegal and only provided from illegal markets, make legal. You have legal production, and you assume that a lot of the people who want to buy it will do so legally, and you will undermine or dry out an illegal economy. The question is, to which extent can you do that? Don't be overwhelmed. I'll summarize for you. There's an important context, of course, to legalization, or a prelude in Canada, without which legalization in 2018 would have never happened. And this prelude begins about 20 years earlier. When, remember I told you, we had full prohibition, cannabis illegal, criminalized. In 1999 and 2000, a couple of people went to our Supreme Court, same equivalent of what is your Supreme Court in Brazil, with very good lawyers. And they said, I am very sick. I have epilepsy or a number of other chronic conditions, which was true. I believe marijuana will help me with this disease, but it's completely illegal. I cannot touch it, I cannot buy it, I cannot use it. Your state will make me a criminal, but under the Canadian Constitution, I have a right to health. Our Constitution, among other things, says you have a right to liberty, safety, to health. I'm sick, this drug can help me, but you don't allow me. You tell me I need to go to jail. I may file a case under my constitutional rights. And the Supreme Court, after many stages, said, yes, we buy that. We agree. The categorical criminalization of cannabis violates your rights or the rights of people with chronic disease. And they basically broke the categorical prohibition of cannabis. They made exceptions. Not only did they make exceptions, they forced the government and said, we tell you, based on constitutional rights, you need to create a system that gives people with chronic disease access to marijuana if it helps their health. This is what the medical marijuana access regulations begin in Canada was really the first nation that then had a national governmental access system for medical marijuana. Of course, it was a horrible thing in the beginning because the government had developed a bureaucracy. People needed to apply, show all their diseases, need confirmation by a doctor. And then the government started growing marijuana in a mine, and I think in Manitoba, they tried to grow the marijuana themselves. It was completely ridiculous, okay? And it was extremely complicated for people to get access. In the first few years, only a few hundred people succeeded with their application, but it broke the ice. It was the first step that broke the ice of prohibition. Successively, the system became liberalized, simplified. At the end of it, like 10 years later, you basically just needed a doctor to sign a form, and you sent that to the government, and they sent you a letter, okay, you're a medical marijuana user. And of course, this moved to the other extreme. I think in 2018, think about what I'm telling you now. In 2018, 2.5% of the Canadian adult population had an exemption for medical marijuana use. Okay? 2.5% of the population, which is several million people, basically went somewhere and said, I have a problem, I don't feel so good, or can't sleep. What would help you? Marijuana. Okay, here you go. And of course, a lot of people did this because it was the way. In the meantime, we had a lot of medical marijuana dispensaries, but also it was your protection against enforcement. If police, for some reason, come, find you with some marijuana, you show your paper, nothing happens. It was a safeguard against problems, and it was your key to marijuana access. And of course, and by the way, this is interesting, all this happened under a government that was sort of like a Canadian Bolsonaro regime, very conservative. It's quite an interesting question why they let that happen. My interpretation is they thought they can allow this because there's so much demand, but they don't have to formally legalize. But this is what happened. And then Trudeau came in and said, we're going to openly and fully legalize in the way that I described to you. But without this medical marijuana system that we had in the prior 18 years, these developments would have never happened. So in many ways, you can think about medical marijuana or medical marijuana provision as a side door or as a first step to legalization. And of course, similar things happened in the United States and in other countries as well, where the first step in many places is medical marijuana, and then it happens successively and extends to pleasure or recreational use. Okay, I described to you already, we arrived at the political decision of legalization here implemented in 2018. And I want to emphasize two other factors. One of them, of course, is that legalization of cannabis in Canada was a political decision by the government. That is different from some US states where you had referendums, right? Where the voters decided, or when I was in New Zealand, had a proposal to legalize, but they made a referendum. What happened? The referendum was lost by 0.6%. So 50.6% were against. Didn't happen. So Canada was more the way that Uruguay did, with its president at the time deciding as a governmental decision to legalize, not as a popular decision by referendum. The other important thing to understand, and I'll describe a little bit the parameters, is that Canada is a federation. We have 10 provinces, 3 territories. It's like sort of like your estados, but the provinces have more powers than your estados. Provinces are relatively independent. They run their own health system. They are administering the criminal justice system. They have a lot of powers. And so, of course, legalization is set within the Federation of Canada. So there's a federal law that says cannabis is legal up to these limits, up to this point, with the general parameters, but then some or many of the crucial regulations are provincially specified. So we have quite a degree of heterogeneity of regulations of what legalization looks in different provinces. I skip this. This is so I'll go through a few things. So it gives you a bit of an idea of what the practical parameters of legalizations look like. As I said, there's a federal law, national law, that defines legalization in its key parameters. Legal, product, access, use, minimum requirements. So the minimum use and access age is 18 years, which is the age of majority in Canada, but it can be higher by province. So we have actually, so what this means in reality in Canada is in most provinces, it is legal from 19 years up. This is the case in all but 2 provinces. And that makes a lot of sense because it's the same age, believe it or not, here in Brazil, the same legal age for alcohol. So you can technically only use or buy alcohol age 19 and up. It's the same in most provinces except for Alberta, where it's 18 at the minimum age, and Quebec increased to 21. So there's 2 provincial exceptions. You can be in possession of up to 30 grams of dried cannabis. That's like a bag. I mean, it should be enough for personal use for a while, but it's limited. Alcohol, I can buy 5 trucks of alcohol if I want, no limit. So just to illustrate a little bit the differences. The places where you can legally buy or they're basically 3 sources where you can get your legal cannabis. There are stores, there are standalone stores. They only sell cannabis, but they're commercial retail stores where you want. It looks a bit like the Apple store or a drugstore. You go in and I show you some pictures in a second. There's stores. Some of these models, depending on the province, are private. Some of them are publicly run. I don't know, for those of you who've been to Canada, you know that we have public monopolies for alcohol. We have like farmacias for alcohol. Not like here in the supermarket. It's changing a little bit, but so there's similar stores, but they are separate. You can buy from the internet directly from the producers. That's option number 2. And then there's home growing. You are allowed to grow up to 4 marijuana plants in your home or your private property. There's again some exceptions by some provinces, but these are the 3 ways you can get your legal marijuana. Who produces the marijuana? We have a commercial industry of licensed producers. So if you want to be a producer, you write to the government, you get a license, they come and inspect you. But most of these companies are now big. They are bought by alcohol companies or other consumption product companies. It's become a very commercial industry. I think the latest number is we have somewhere between 700 and 800 commercial licensed cannabis producers. That is a lot. It's also the reason why the industry is not doing well. They're not doing well economically because there's way too many. There's an oversaturation of the production market. One of the other important parts of the regulations is that the government introduced a very tough law for cannabis impaired driving. So we have a so-called per se law. So you don't have to get into an accident to have problems. It is categorically prohibited to be driving with these very small amounts of THC in blood. So what we have is systems, I think it's similar to what happens for alcohol in Brazil. Road stops, they stop you, they give you a saliva device. These devices are now relatively good for cannabis. If any indication, you need to give a blood test. And if you have any of those limits, you can either be convicted to a fine or you can go to jail. So they try to do deterrence, but there's not a lot of enforcement. It's a tricky issue. Other parts of the rules, no cannabis advertising. So you cannot advertise, you cannot promote. Of course, in the age of the internet, that's difficult to enforce. And of course, the other big question I mentioned earlier is, what about youth? Because all of this is only for adults, but I showed you earlier, the prevalence of use among young people under 18 is high, 40%, 45%. And this is, of course, one of the questions, how does legalization work for young people? And the government came up with sort of a compromise, which is that below 5 grams of possession, the police will not do anything, but over 5 grams, which is a tiny amount, they can still enforce, arrest young people and charge them, which I think is a very problematic part of legalization because it completely misses to protect young people, because a young person can still get criminally charged, get convicted, and can get their life destroyed because of a little bit of pot in their pocket. This is what I call the Achilles heel of legalization, is what to do with young people. On the other hand, no politician wants to appear as liberal or, you know, I neglect the health of children or young people by saying, well, we will legalize for them as well. It's a very tricky aspect of legalization, what to do with young people under the age of majority. This just a little bit illustration about, this is Canada, obviously the different minimum age, personal cultivation, home growing allowed in some provinces, not in others. Use is allowed in public in some provinces, not in others. Again, there's diversity. So again, for public health, that's a tricky thing, right? Because on the one hand, you don't want so much cannabis use in public, but then when it's not allowed in public, what happens? You basically confine it to private homes. Don't forget, Canada is not like Brazil. In many of these places, for most of the year, it's cold. People are not in street, okay, drinking cachaça somewhere in the bar that is open, but a lot of people are at home. So if you say you can't use in public, where will people use? They use at home. What do homes look like? Most homes have other people, right? Children, other family members. So again, from a public health perspective, it's a very important question. What is better? Tell people use in public or only home? What works best for public health? Here, this is the model of retail distribution. Again, what I'm trying to illustrate here to you is Canadian legalization is not homogeneous. There's quite a bit of heterogeneity of regulations on different aspects, depending on province. This is a little bit what these stores look like. So these stores are all within 10 minutes of walking distance from my house. I have one place that I can reach where I can buy alcohol. I have at least 6 places. I only show you 4 here where I can buy cannabis. But you can see this looks, I don't know what your expectations were, but a lot of these stores is sort of a bit fancy, a bit like, oh, look, you here kind of, we look like the Apple store. It's like lifestyle, right? They promote lifestyle with design and attractive interior. The products are not cheap. So this isn't like, you know, I buy something from some guy at the corner, you know, for like a couple of dollars. This is a lot is promoted and executed as a lifestyle product increasingly. This is what the reality of commercial cannabis legalization looks like in the reality. So a few words about what we know about effects. Of course, so far I only described to you what the design was and the intentions. Let's look a little bit about what we know about the effects. And so, just to preempt a little bit, the challenge, eventually you need to assess legalization as a policy. Is it a good idea, is it a bad idea, is it a mixed idea? How do you do that? And of course, there's a million different things you could look at, right? You can look at all sorts of indicators, you can look at different outcomes. So we, for example, a couple of years ago, we defined like an inventory of about a dozen main indicators of importance for public health. Like what you need to measure, what you need to assess to understand the main impacts that are relevant for public health. I'm not going to read them all to you, but they range from prevalence of use, age of use initiation, use modes, dependence, hospitalizations, driving. There's sort of an inventory of indicators relevant for public health. And on many of those, not all, but many by now, there's some pretty good studies. In Canada, among other things, in the provinces, in some provinces, some people have access to public population databases of diseases, hospitalizations, healthcare. It's similar to the SUS system in Brazil, but for provinces. We don't have this nationally, at least not for most things. But on that basis, there are some good data also facilitated by Canada, which more or less has a public healthcare system. So there are some databases that can be utilized for some of these things. Other things you need to use surveys, right? For understanding prevalence of use, age of use initiation, you need to use surveys. Some of the surveys are good, some of the surveys are not so good, but I'll give you some examples. Outcome, we already did some summaries, does not matter here, so there's some work on it. So this is a little bit of data from what is called the Canadian Cannabis Survey. The government created a survey, first implemented in 2017, is across the country, relatively large sample, not really representative, but it gives some good ideas of indicators on some things. Cannabis use, and I'll just illustrate for you a little bit to give you a big picture impressions. Okay, if you want to follow up, I can give you the sources, or you can look them up. They're all publicly available. Look at what happened, and then just look at these things, and then make yourself a picture. Remember the objectives that I mentioned, right? The 3 objectives: improve public health and safety, reduce cannabis use and access by youth, and reduce illicit markets. And then think about what you see as a picture. Cannabis use prevalence in the population. So this is the year before. Remember, here is legalization implementation in October. This is before, and these years are all after. Okay, so for a general picture. Cannabis use prevalence, 22% 27%. Just don't read too much into it. Don't try to make significant statistics. Just look at the big general picture for impression. Okay, kind of going up. Cannabis use among young people. This is what we refer to as young adults. And here's among youth. Look at these things. More or less, well, this you could say goes up. This probably not significant, is more or less stable at high levels, remains more or less 4 out of 10. This is minors. This is adolescents, right? These are not adults. So stays at high level. Near daily use, which we defined as one of the high-risk behaviors, 24%, 25%, remains the same. Now, one important development of legalization has been that there's been a diversification of use modes. So before, most people more or less smoked with or without tobacco. Now, through legalization, you have more of a diversification. More people use edibles. There's more and more vaping of extracts with electronic devices, like you use an e-cigarette device with cannabis extracts. So there's a diversification of use modes that is quite strong. Here are the prevalence rates of driving under the influence of cannabis from here to here. A bit of a downward trend, but it's still 1 in 4 cannabis users drives within a few hours of consumption. Lots of good for public health. Is a pretty significant risk behavior. So you already get a bit of a sense of what's happening here. This is really the great public health success story, okay? So there, depending on how you interpret this, some things go up, diversification here, some things go down a little bit, but it's quite a mixed picture of things. So it's a good question. How do you interpret this for public health? I'll give you just a few more examples. Let's skip this. This is data from Ontario. This is only Ontario population, but this is almost 40% of the total Canadian population. Representative data, cannabis use, daily use, and related problems among the general adult population in Ontario, 2001 to 2019. So here's the announcement of legalization. Here's legalization. And this is after. Pretty clearly, and this is significant, okay? All of those things. You have a general liberalization of cannabis, and over time, all this goes up. This, again, don't try and understand it all, but illustrates numerically and visually the diversification of use modes. That's quite significant because in those stores that I showed you, you can buy flower, like a traditional marijuana product for smoking, but you can also buy the vape extracts and the edibles and the drinkables. So this product portfolio, the menu of products is there. And people clearly diversify the way they use in different ways. So going away from smoking, which from a public health perspective is actually a good thing, I think, because it comes with main risks for the pulmonary system. And now there's risks for other things. A lot of people think vaping, there's no risks. That's not true. You still inhale something with toxins and that can be problematic for the pulmonary system. And the problem about edibles is a lot of people underestimate the delay of effects. So the pharmacodynamics create a delay in psychoactive effects if you ingest. So you need to wait a few hours, and people get impatient. They think, I want to have effect from this cannabis, is not coming, and I need more and more. And then you have overdoses or excessive effects of what people expected. But that's a matter of people learning and adjusting to those realities because it's a relatively new form of use. The edibles use is particularly common among middle-aged and a lot of older people have begun cannabis consumption under legalization, people 50, 60 years and up. And they like edibles because they don't want to do crazy things like smoking or vaping. They like the edibles, but it has its own distinct risks that comes with it. Okay. Another interesting question for public health, and I'm throwing out mostly snapshots of info and with some questions. One potential benefit of legalization could be that cannabis use, even if it goes up, could replace or substitute for other drug use, specifically alcohol. So there's some measurement here in Canada that shows with time series analysis that there may actually be a small substitution effect on alcohol sales. So increase in cannabis sales in some provinces correlate with a slight downward trend for alcohol consumption. There's also some evidence from the US. There may be a bit of a substitution effect for alcohol. So this could be one of the main arguments in Brazil to legalize cannabis, okay? Because you have a lot of alcohol consumption, and if there's actual effects, that could be a beneficial thing. You know that in North America, we have a huge opioid crisis. Some people have said, well, if there's some substitution effects, that could be a good thing. I don't think it would work for opioids, maybe other things, but that's an area of exploration that is very important for the policy outcomes of legalization. There's some evidence that there may be what we refer to as substitution effects on other drugs, very preliminarily, but at a very modest level. At the same time, there's evidence from the US and Canada that with legalization, the co-use of cannabis and alcohol is actually going up. So that points in the other direction. So another qualifier again, I'm not throwing conclusions to you. I just give you snapshots of what we know so far. Co-use and substitution effects with other drugs, very important. So what happens with hospital episodes, emergency department visits? My colleague Daniel Murrin from Ontario did some very good analysis for Ontario, again, the largest province, looking at all emergent cannabis-related emergency department visits before legalization, in the initial phase of legalization, and in the second phase, which included the legalization of edibles. Over time, I mean, it's nice when you have studies like that, right? Where you just need to look at the picture and kind of get the idea. So for both young youth and adults, clearly significant effects of increases in cannabis-related emergency department visits from legalization, both in phase 1 and then very, very distinctly so in phase 2, when edibles were added to the menu of drugs that were of cannabis that were sold. So clearly increases in emergency department visits associated with legalization. Here, another interesting study that shows you how complex all of this is. Russ Callahan and his colleagues, he looked at emergency department presentations for cannabis-induced psychosis and schizophrenia in Ontario and Alberta. So he presents it with an interesting dilemma for interpretation of effects. Look at this curve, okay? This is an ARIMA analysis from before. This is legalization here, 2018. So what do you see? You see something that goes up, but you see something that's been going up before, right? And this break here is not in any way significant. It's just a continuity of trends. So this already illustrates very nicely also one of the dilemmas. How to interpret policy effect? You just look at this and say, oh yeah, it goes up. You can do that. or do you consider trends from before? So here clearly there's increasing trends in these outcomes related to emergency department visits, but you can qualify them and say, well, it just continues from what used to happen before. But the majority of outcomes look like this. This is again from Daniel Murren's group. Emergency department visits for hyperemesis syndrome, cannabis-related in Ontario hospitals. Look, it's the same as ED visits from before, with clear increases in the first phase of legalization, and then with edibles, things jump up quite massively when the edibles come into the picture. Pediatric poisonings, one of the main concerns for edibles, because if you have edibles, a concern that's arisen is that you have a product, young people, children, infants mistake the drug for something they can eat as a sweet or as something, and some of them are actually designed in ways that are misleading to children. So we have quite a sharp increase of pediatric poisonings related to cannabis edible. Like these slopes and these breaks are pretty significant, right? Like there's, I mean, the baseline numbers, keep the context in the picture here. The baseline numbers are very small. So these are very dramatic, absolute changes in numbers, and obviously significant, but that is a concern as well, increased developments. This is the same thing again, pediatric poisonings related to cannabis after legalization go up significantly. This is looking at the data a little bit differently. Here you see an interesting effect though. I mentioned to you earlier the province of Quebec, which has been more restrictive. They have a public monopoly on sales. They don't allow home grow. They increase the minimum age. There are some discernible effects that a more restricted regulation for legalization may actually be beneficial for health outcomes. Cannabis-related acute care visits to hospitals for pregnant women. I told you earlier, an increasing number of pregnant women use cannabis to self-medicate pregnancy-induced nausea, primarily in the first trimester. Quite common in North America, increasingly common so. Look, same development, right? Jumps up quite significantly with adverse outcomes. Of course, this does not necessarily have to be limited only to self-medication. It can be that pregnant women simply continue to use cannabis during pregnancy. So clearly increases in hospital visits. Driving, a little bit conflicting data. Again, Russ Callahan's group looked at the overall developments of traffic injury. This isn't just cannabis related. This is basically all traffic injury presentations in emergency departments in Ontario and Alberta from before to after legalization. There is no discernible effects in these data that cannabis legalization here would have changed those trends or levels. Different picture from British Columbia. This is from Jeffrey Brubaker in the New England Journal of Medicine. He showed that with legalization, there's been a discernible significant increase in the number of people that present with motor vehicle accident injuries that have THC in their blood. Very significant increase here in both the prevalence of people who present with THC and the amount of THC in their blood. So again, the general liberalization increases the number or the proportion of people who have THC in their system. What that exactly does or to which extent it's responsible for why they had an accident and an injury is another question. But on an epidemiological basis, the number of people with THC in their blood who get injured from a car crash and show up in a hospital goes up, which is not a development we want to have. So, just quickly about the other side of use, supply. Basically, just two sets of data that show you that an increasing number of people, sorry if that's a little bit out of focus, but basically what this shows is that the number of the proportion of people who consume cannabis in legalization, these numbers are a little bit clearer, who buy or obtain their cannabis from legal sources steadily goes up. So this refers to the objective of illegal markets and reducing criminal activity. So depending on product type, in 2020, 2021, somewhere between 50 and 80% cannabis consumers go to legal sources to buy their cannabis. So that in some ways is good news because it's basically the majority of people go and source their cannabis legally. But that is a stepwise process. And at the same time, that still involves a pretty sizable number of people who don't go to legal sources and still buy their cannabis illegally or go to dealers or buy from other illegal sources. So again, legalization, a success to some degree, but there's a significant number of people who don't source their cannabis legally, and we know a little bit about the causes. One of the main factors associated with not buying from legal sources is intensity of use. So the people who use a lot of cannabis or high frequency, high potency, in other words, your highest risk consumers are less likely to go to legal sources. And that's, of course, exactly the people who want to get to legal sources, to give them better product, better protect them, maybe educate them a bit, but that's one of the groups that still stays away from legal sources primarily. So a lot of work to do here. This is a stepwise process over time. It takes time. And we're at the 5-year mark, right? Like these numbers may continue to go up, but they're far away from, for example, what we know about alcohol. We know that in Canada, about 99% of people who consume alcohol go to a legal store. They don't buy from dealers or don't, produce it at home. This is still a little bit different here. So there's a ways to go for the supply side. And the question is, will that ever happen? Because the illegal cannabis industry, illegal dealers have adjusted. They lower their price. They offer things that you can't get in the legal store, high potency things, other special sort of products. So it will be very interesting to see how the illegal black market will adjust to the continued realities of legalization. Okay, I will come to conclusions. One thing I will quickly talk about is simply political acceptance of legalization. I show you this here, 2014. This is just before Trudeau was elected. Public survey. We're about close to 40%, a minority, sizable minority, but it's the minority of the population approved or supported legalization as a policy option. So you see the gamble that Trudeau took at the time. This was just a year before his election. These are mostly young people. He was able to mobilize them, but it was a minority. This is in 2018, just after legalization. This has become a reality that is accepted by Canadians, and I don't think I could show you crazy health outcomes and that accidents triple and that all the health outcomes, go up like crazy. This will never change, or not in the next 25 years. This has become reality in Canadian society. And there's also a little bit like the support is there by almost 3/4 of the population. There's also Canadians associate with this a lot. We are the country that legalized, etc. We're sort of unique pioneers. So this is, of course, interesting for policy evaluation from a scientific perspective, right? When you have this, do the outcomes still matter? Because what I showed is not necessarily a success story for public health, right? Like a lot of the problems have gone up. That's the reality. And I'm someone who's generally friendly with the concept of legalization for public health. But if you strictly look at the public health indicators, you would not really sell this as a success story because a lot of the problems have grown. I'm going to skip over this and I'm just going to present you some conclusions. So I showed you the idea, some of the details, and some of the outcomes we know so far. This remains a policy experiment in many ways, right? We cannot say at this point, is legalization a success or the right thing to do? This is a social and in many ways a public health experiment that is ongoing. So I don't need to repeat this really. We have mixed effects. Use goes up mostly. Young people use remains high. There's absolutely no indication that the government met its objectives that the use among young people would go down. No way. It's at the same level, maybe even increasing. So very mixed evidence in regards to the objectives. We have some increases in adverse health risks and outcomes. Other things remain level. And I showed you an example of how some of the things, some of the developments extend trends from pre-legalization. It is really challenging what you say to a politician or other people at the end of the day when they ask you, so was this a good idea or not, or what? It's a mixed story at this point, I would suggest. The public health outcomes alone don't really justify legalization so far. But the other thing that I mentioned in passing that we need to include in benefit assessments is the social justice benefits, right? Prior to legalization, we had about 50,000 to 70,000 arrests every year of individuals for personal use or possession of cannabis. Criminal arrests, all the adverse consequences. That is not there anymore. So that is a social justice benefit. Of course, you need to weigh this scientifically vis-a-vis the public health outcomes. So this is a real challenge for how to comprehensively assess this kind of policy change. You can't just look at the hospital data, you need to look at other things as well. I shared with you my concern about youth as a vulnerable group, young people. They are left out of the benefits of legalization. They're using, they still need to go to a dealer. Of course, many of them have a big brother who can buy legally and it passes on. We have this sort of indirect distribution, if you will, or dispersion effects, but they are left out of the direct benefits of legalization, and they can still get arrested and become criminalized, which I find very problematic. I alluded a little bit to the problematic state of industry. There's way too many legal producers and dealers. You look at their stock value, it's gone down. Many of them go bankrupt. And the other effect that concerns me quite a bit is that there's a strong trend of industry merging, where it's now alcohol companies or multinationals, tobacco companies are increasingly buying tobacco. That this consumption good and the industry becomes absorbed by larger industries that we know are not good for public health. Okay, you don't want public health in the hands of multinational alcohol companies or tobacco companies. We know those case studies and the effects of that. So that is a concern that increasingly extends to cannabis right now. And we don't understand very well the effects of these developments on the commercial or the industry side. Yet, legalization is spreading. Of course, Uruguay was the first. It's by now, it's about half of the US states that have some form of legalization. Thailand legalized. Germany is in the process of legalizing. Switzerland is in the process of legalizing. The Netherlands will formally legalize, probably. Here's my question for you. Perhaps Brazil, we can discuss this. Whether that's on the horizon, I personally don't think so. I can tell you why. But and of course, the other big question is, what are the implications for other drugs? Right? We legalized cannabis 5 years ago. It's become a normal thing. What about psychostimulants? We have, by the way, in Vancouver, a first legal psychostimulant, like psychedelic mushroom store that looks like the cannabis stores. It's technically not legal, but it's there. The police leave it alone. Maybe what I just told you, if I come back here in 10 years or 20, maybe we'll tell the same story about other drugs. It's a very good question. There's a lot of advocates that say we need to extend this model to other drugs, even cocaine or other things, but we'll leave that story for another day. So that was my tour de force overview. I hope it gave you a good impression, cursory impression about the framework and state of legalization in Canada. How are we doing for time? We have a little bit of time left for questions and answers. I hope I didn't overwhelm you, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Benedict. That's a very comprehensive view of the subject. Gente, vamos abrir então para perguntas, tá? As perguntas podem ser feitas em inglês ou do you understand the questions in Portuguese or okay, não, ok. Sim, então, se alguém quiser fazer em português, eu tento ajudar aqui na tradução e a gente está monitorando também no YouTube. Cláudia, vem aqui no microfone só para o pessoal que está assistindo pela internet poder ouvir.
Congratulations. It's very comprehensive speaking, very nice. Okay. My question is about the public health outcomes and the fact that it don't justify legalization. Would this not be due an artificial increase in the prevalence of this consumption and the health outcomes? Because we expect that when you have the legalization, people start to talk about that, research, find people, because it's a hidden population. So if you go to the houses of these people or in the hospitals, people start to report, oh, it's in the past, did you use, or in this moment? So, and an effect of the recent legalization, because we expect that in the first moment you have an increase, but when you, okay.
Is there, do we know this works as well? Is it okay? This microphone, or should I use this? So thank you for the question. There are several important elements in your question that I'll try and address. First of all, there's definitely a potential role of what we call a novelty effect or a straw fire effect. There, you have something new and people get excited, want to try, and we should not underestimate, there are a lot of people who criticize prohibition for many things, but deterrence may be a reality to some effect. Deterrence meaning that you make something illegal, and for some people respect the law, even though they think it does not make a lot of sense, but they say, my parents told me to not do things that are not legal, and I stay away. And now for many people it's different, and they go out, or even we have this effect in middle age or established adults who say, I didn't do this for a long time, but I remember now I was in university, now it's legal, I can buy on the street, you saw the stores. So all these things can play into the novelty effect, which is of course why we need to give this more time for conclusions, right? It's not a lot of time, 5 years. We need to see what does it look like in 10 years. We can make better judgment of effects. But the other thing you mentioned, potential, data survey bias. We don't really have this. All the surveys I showed you are either full population data or they're high quality representative population surveys. So, there's no selection bias. And we know, the Canadian surveys are very good, where they tested for social desirability effect. No one is afraid and hasn't been afraid for a long time to talk about their cannabis use. Is not, really like I killed several people. That's a different story. But there's not really concern about social desirability. So I think the reporting is very good. I think the main factor is what you mentioned first, the novelty effect. And it will be interesting to see how that wears off, or if that goes down, and especially among young people, because I've worked quite a bit in substance use prevention with young people. And usually one of the most effective ways to have young people do something is by adults going and saying, don't do this, right? Like we know this from tobacco prevention, for example. There's a lot of effort that's gone into don't smoke, it's bad for you. And what's the effect? It creates subcultures of resistance. So one of the hypotheses is that, or has been, is that legalization may actually make cannabis use boring for young people because now it's legal. So far, there's no evidence for that. And of course, the other question is then what happens as the substitute, right? You don't know. We have these naive assumptions about prevention. Maybe young people stop using cannabis and we think, now they're going to sit at home and study all day. Well, or the alternative is they could use other stuff that is a lot more dangerous, right? Like there's a lot of things we don't understand, but your questions are legitimate and important. They emphasize the importance of very good monitoring, evaluation, and high quality of data. It's very important to understand what's happening.
Oh, Benedict, thank you for your not a Bob Marley talk as defined it. I have two questions about two things that you have mentioned. The first one is you said that you don't see legalization in Brazil as something that could happen in the near future. I can imagine why, but I would like, okay. Yeah, you said you don't see in the near future. Maybe I can tell you why. So the first question is in that direction. I'd like to hear you. And the second one, it's about advertising, because you said no cannabis advertising, promotion, or products geared to youth in Canada. But I was curious about advertising to adults. Is there open advertising of cannabis to adults? And if there isn't, like advertising in TV or something like that, but the stores, you said that walking distance from your house, there's like 6 stores, cannabis stores. They're beautiful. They're really beautiful and very attractive. So for me, I think that this is kind of a marketing. I don't know if, what do you think about that?
What was your name, please? Rogério. Thank you for the question. No problem. Your questions are very good. So let me first clarify the facts. There's generally no advertising or promotion allowed for cannabis. And what applies specifically to youth is, in addition, you can sell or offer products that are specifically geared to young people. So things that look like gummy bears or, chocolates or whatever. However, as you mentioned as the crucial point and insight, this is sort of a bit of a Sisyphus exercise, because what is advertising? What is promoting? So we do not have, posters or advertisements from cannabis industry that say, use as much cannabis as you can and use my product, like the open direct advertisement. But as you point out, first of all, we're in the virtual age, and the industries have become very smart. So they host conventions about cannabis and health. There's workshops. They did some indirect promotion for a while. And of course, as you say, the stores themselves, the way they are designed, they all have branding, they have names, the design, the interior is very attractive. As you say, that is advertising and is branding. So the feasibility of a prohibition or the restriction on advertising and branding is basically impossible. And then, of course, if you go on websites, I had a student look into this a little bit. I mean, in the internet, it's all over the place, right? Like it's indirect or through mechanisms that aren't directly open advertising, but that are quasi-active. You can't restrict it. I mean, what you don't have is, you don't have the Marlboro man on the horse, right? Smoke, or the camel man or whoever it was, right? Directly showing the product or the alcohol advertisement on TV. That does not exist. The direct stuff, the explicit stuff, but there's so many hybrid and indirect ways, and it's the stores themselves. There was a discussion for a while in Canada whether the requirement for the stores and the products would be completely boring. Only name, black, white, not even a special font, nothing color, no symbol, no logo, nothing. The industry said, we're not going to do that. We need an identity, blah, blah, blah. But that's already opening the door for advertising and promotion. So your question's right on the money. And, they tried to restrict it for political utility, but that only works to a certain degree. Your other question was about Brazil. I think, well, I know some other Latin American countries. I worked with Uruguay quite a bit, and their policy people and the government, and it's a very different social political makeup and profile of society in the country. I think the main factor that will prevent legalization in your country is that religion and politics has a very strong role here. You're a much less secular society than, for example, Uruguay, where sort of social and other values and are much more separate. Like the church and state is much more separate than here. And I think that's one of the factors that would prevent a progression in sort of, in kind of this direction. It's interesting more, and I try and bring this topic also into context of, broader studies, social, legal, medical studies. There's a strong association between cannabis legalization at the moment and progressive policies with other morality politics, right? Stances on abortion, sex work, medically assisted dying. It's actually an article that needs to be written that looks at, the co-occurrence of different kinds of policies in these different arenas. Of all the things that I just mentioned, Canada is progressive on all of those, including medically assisted dying. You look at European countries, Switzerland, for example. Switzerland is a fascinating phenomenon. It's a very conservative, socially conservative country in terms of, traditional social values, but on all of these fronts, highly progressive, with progressive policies. It's very interesting to understand and dissect when. Anyway, I'm rambling a bit, but I think there's a few forces in Brazil, like social, cultural, other forces that are more on the conservative side that will prevent, steps in this direction. But let's again talk in 10 years, see if I was right or wrong. Bye bye.
Pessoal, Martinho, vamos lá. Você falou que no Canadá a legalização do uso recreativo da cannabis é algo normal, você precisa pelo uso terapêutico medicinal da cannabis. No Brasil, temos a regularização do uso virtual em enteógenos, a ayahuasca. No Canadá, como se lida com o uso virtual?
First of all, I'll comment a bit on the, the categorical concept of medical and therapeutic and recreational use. It's an artificial division, okay? So, and of course, what I showed you with the medical use in the beginning, that of course was the policy regime. And since that initially allowed for medical use and protect these people from law enforcement. And of course, what do smart people do? They say, I use medically because it's the way to protect myself. When it's interesting, we have data now that in surveys, surprise, surprise, since 2018, the self-reported medical use has dropped by more than 50%. Why? Because don't need to use this as explanation anymore for legitimate behavior. And of course, in the reality, think about the people that use cannabis, or this is not a black and white story, right? I mean, of course, there are people who are recreational users. They go to party, they want a bit fun, smoke up, feel a bit relaxed, whatever. There on the other side, extreme end of the spectrum, there are people with severe chronic diseases, pain, some psychological problems, sleep problems, who really go to this substance for some mainly therapeutic benefit. And then there are a lot of people in the middle who are sort of somewhere in the middle, right, in the gray. It's just like a lot of, I mean, 40% of people who continue to use tobacco have psychological comorbidities. It's also a form of self-medication in many ways. So anyways, this is not a black and white story. This is a grayscale story in many ways. For us to answer the other part of your question, I mean, ayahuasca use has spread even now into the northern hemisphere. There's people who go to this as a bit exotic sort of thing. Our system don't really regulate or consider the ritual use a lot because we don't have these traditions. There's some indigenous groups that use different psychoactive substances in their rituals. Like we have indigenous populations, the founders of Canada is a small population, but they use tobacco products. They use cannabis now more ritualistically. Of course, they were punished hard by alcohol. That was not part of their culture and destroyed a lot of lives. But it doesn't have nearly the presence or the position or the recognition, ritual use that it has in your or other Latin American cultures. So it's much more at the margins. I hope that answers your question.
Pessoal, mais alguém? A gente já está estourando o tempo. Ô, Madalena, rapidinho.
Thank you very much, Benedict. I have a very fast question. Is because you said that there is criminalization for the youth in Canada, and I also wanted to know if the criminalization for the use of alcohol is the same for the use of cannabis for the youth in Canada. Thank you.
So first of all, the criminalization for cannabis for young people only happens when there's an incident and the police become active. And of course, there's a very powerful stratification happening that, you know, if you look at the data, so who are the young people who get arrested for cannabis? Well, it's typically poor people, often racial minorities, because all this only happens in public space in the street. The police don't come to people's homes. So there's a stratification, and it's only small numbers at this point, but it's still a possibility. Whereas we don't have criminalization for alcohol for young people. There's nothing in the youth, just only if you, in conjunction with alcohol, do other things like violence, driving or whatever. So here's another, you know, different approach in terms of justice between alcohol and cannabis. Of course, alcohol is very common among young people, underage drinking, but our system mostly goes after the people who provided alcohol to young people, who sold to young people, or parents who neglected. So, but these are different approaches. But I think it's very interesting and relevant how the, you know, control of cannabis with young people will unfold, and whether a lot of them will get arrested or charged. But I just want to mention again, my other concern is around discretion. You understand that term? It's basically the power of police to choose what to do, because they have this right now, right? And discretion can be a very ambivalent thing, because we know this for police, as I said earlier, or gave the example, you know, we know there's discretion, for example, by sex or gender, right? Like if, depending on who they have encounters with or make decisions about, if they like their face, if they like their behavior. the whole area of young people and cannabis remains very, very challenging. And it's particularly important because they are the most vulnerable, and you can destroy a lot of their lives and their futures by just one decision about this. And so we need to understand this a lot better, but it's different than what we do with alcohol.
Okay. Vou fazer uma última questão para a gente encerrar. I will make a last question. The first is connected with Madalena's question. Are there specific preventive measures from the point of view of public health targeting young people? And the second one is another subject. How do you overcome? Did you overcome the resistance from this psychiatry, this association? Because here in Brazil, it's they have a very ultra conservative point of view, and they are it's very difficult to deal with them.
Okay, Rossano, you saved the gold nuggets for the end, testing all my energy until the end. The government launched with legalization there, and you can see some of the examples on the Government of Canada and other websites. They launched some extensive prevention program for young people. The effects I will mark with question marks. They did a lot, they try a lot, and of course it's not the first time that there's prevention for cannabis. Usually the effects are pretty limited, and I mentioned some of the factors earlier, also because it depends a lot on how is this formulated, presented. We know that the best prevention typically for young people is done by young people, where they develop the messages and the delivery and design. But so things were done. There's a lot of things out there. The question, the effects is in question. The question about the psychiatrists is interesting. So before legalization, I was still mainly worked in Toronto in the country's largest psychiatric hospital. It's a university hospital in Toronto for psychiatry. And I was in charge of developing the policy position on legalization in that hospital. And of course, this hospital is run by psychiatrists. They are the ones in power. And it was about 1 year of my life, the experience I will never forget, because, you know, the debates and psychosis, and it's harmful. But we had a CEO, like the leader of the hospital, who herself was not a psychiatrist, but a neurologist. And with a lot of convincing on data, on evidence, we convinced them to endorse public health, legalization for public health, obviously with a lot of focus on mental health, clarifying the data and convincing the overall potential benefits of preventing mental health. We were successful in creating support for legalization, even in that environment, but it's tough. There was one slide that I jumped over that, you know, there were still their editorial in the medical journals and psychiatry journals, cannabis, psychosis. It remains a concern. It's scary to people. And, you know, the resistance isn't gone, but I think the resistance is a bit less religious than what I know it to be, for example, here. I mean, ours, you know, our psychiatrists is also a heterogeneous population, but many of them understand data, they look at data, but they are a powerful source of resistance. Some of it is ideological, some of it relates to data, and, you know, I don't want to dismiss their concerns. I mean, some of the mental health problems are severe, but I tried to give you today a big picture of the data for public health. And so hopefully that will be interesting, not to just illustrate Canada, but for the coming Brazilian debates, because you will have a lot of resistance 2.
Yeah. Thank you. Pessoal, obrigado pela presença. E amanhã, né, a gente tem o workshop pela manhã e pela tarde. Quem puder vir também, vai ser avançar um pouco mais de alguns assuntos que o Benedict introduziu aqui. Thank you. So, see you tomorrow. Ok. Tchau, gente. Obrigado para quem está assistindo.